Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are connecting from. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands and the Global Center on Adaptation, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session on accelerating adaptation investments for resilient infrastructure. My name is Ede Illas, Senior Advisor for the Global Center on Adaptation, and I will be helping with the moderation of this interesting panel. We are very pleased for the collaboration with the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure and for participating in the International Conference on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure 22 today. It is my great pleasure. I have seen how ICDRI has grown from an idea to a real coalition, bringing so many countries around the world for action. Before introducing you to today's high-level dialogue, I want to invite first Mr. Kees van der Burg, who is the Vice Minister of Mobility of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, to share a message with you. Please join me in watching this video. Thank you.
Good day to all of you watching. Thank you for joining today's session. As the Netherlands, we are glad to organize a live webcast about accelerating adaptation investments, together with the Global Center on Adaptation. I thank Professor Patrick Verkooyen for his introduction and moderating this event. Ladies and gentlemen, the science is clear. The recent IPCC report explains that the window of opportunity to reach a climate neutral and climate resilient world is closing. Adaptation and mitigation are two sides of the same coin. We need to act, and we need to act faster and more resolute. From the Paris Agreement of 2015 onwards, we became increasingly aware of the need to adapt. With our adaptation plans, nationally and in our case on a European level, we set goals to achieve a climate resilient future. In a changing geopolitical landscape and rebuilding from an ongoing global pandemic, collaboration to further action is more important than ever. Therefore, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management hosted the Climate Adaptation Summit in January 21 to give international adaptation action a boost. Together with many partners worldwide, we organized an anchoring event on resilient infrastructure. It explains why we choose to become part of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We as the Netherlands are committed to reach climate neutrality and climate resilience by 2050. However, we are not there yet. And we do not have all the answers and solutions needed yet. To speak in infrastructural terms, we need to build the bridge and that we are already crossing together. First, we have a world win in identifying risk and opportunities for the adaptation actions through the execution of stress tests. In the Netherlands, we recently finished stress tests in all infrastructure domains. Now we are in the process of discussing the way forward through executing risk dialogues and study necessary measures. Internationally, the Global Center of Adaptation is currently developing an international stress test facility commissioned by our ministry. Secondly, a second challenge concerns financial investments in adaptation action, the theme of this session. During the Climate Adaptation Summit, we connected the awareness that every dollar invested in resilient infrastructure can have up to $4 of benefits. However, finance is not yet following the right projects. In the Netherlands, financing of infrastructural projects could be successfully implemented for a long time due to availability and reliability of budgets. We created an infrastructure fund and a delta fund to commit to long-term investments and projects. However, we also need to involve financial institutions and the private sector more. We have to show them that investments in climate resilient infrastructure eventually results in higher gains for society and business. And thirdly, another challenge I would like to hear on your thoughts on concerns moving on from grey to green infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, research shows that nature-based solutions may not only be cheaper than traditional infrastructure, it's essential to include the preservation and restoration of biodiversity in our infrastructure projects. To make this idea common thought, we need to mainstream nature-based solutions in our day-to-day discussions and decision-making process in building and refurbishing climate-resilient infrastructure. I'm glad that the Global Centre of Adaptation launched the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Public-Private Partner Toolkit and the Certified Climate Resilient Infrastructure Officer program. In short, we have to move forward towards thinking with nature instead of against nature. My dear friends, the science is clear about the fact that our window of opportunity is closing. We need to work closely together, communicate honestly about the challenges at hand, and explore uncharted and innovative ways forward. I'm sure that you will have a fruitful discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, the Netherlands are committed to continue the contribution and collaboration within the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, accelerating adaptation action globally. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Vice Minister van der Berg, for that description of Netherlands' ambition on adaptation. There are very few countries in the world where I can think of how adaptation to climate is embedded not only in infrastructure, but also on the behaviors and the ideas of the population. And you have highlighted the importance of how working together and finding innovative ways to promote a climate resilient future. And the Global Centre on Adaptation is pleased to be working in collaboration with your ministry to promote climate resilient infrastructure. Now, I would like to share a message from Professor van der Hooyen, the CEO of the Global Centre on Adaptation, for this conference. Let's listen to the video.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be addressing you today in the International Conference for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And thank you to Prime Minister Modi for India's strong leadership on this important agenda. And thank you also to the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water of the Netherlands for co-hosting this session with the Global Centre on Adaptation, or the GCA. The IPCC's latest report delivered a clear message. There is a narrow opportunity to adapt to climate change, and we need to act now. Climate adaptation is not an either-or challenge. 1.5 degrees of warming is fast becoming a reality for all of us by 2030. Therefore, adaptation should not be seen as a cost, but as an investment. Every individual, every farmer, every small enterprise or corporation is vulnerable to climate risk because they all depend to some degree on infrastructure, roads, energy, water, and other services. And ensuring that these vital networks and systems can operate under future climate scenarios is vital for us and for our economies. Damages to infrastructure assets due to climate change are projected to be as much as $22 billion per year by 2050 globally. In Ghana, for example, GCA research has shown that climate risk could lead to $3.9 billion in damages to the transport sector alone by 2050, and 80% of population risk being cut off from healthcare. In South Asia, GDP per capita losses due to climate change in deltas can reach up to 20%. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, can only be achieved if education, health, and infrastructure services like water are adapted to the accelerating shocks of climate change. The only solution is to act at scale and at speed, and this is what drives us at GCA. With the support of the African Union, GCA, and the African Development Bank, we launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP, to mobilize $25 billion in adaptation investments across the African continent. In its first year, the AAAP shaped adaptation responses within a $1.5 billion of multilateral development bank investments in the areas of food security, resilient infrastructure, climate finance, and youth employment, and already $1.6 billion in the first quarter of this year. This includes ensuring resilient renewable energy for over 250 million people under the so-called Desert to Power initiative, enhancing the resilience of port operations in the port of Banjul and Dover, critical trade access for the Gambia, and mainstreaming adaptation and resilience into infrastructure investments across other countries, including in Ghana, Kenya, and Senegal. These are just some illustrative examples. Under the AAAP, GCA and the African Development Bank and other partners such as the European Investment Bank and the World Bank, we are working to identify a pipeline of resilient infrastructure investments. So, ladies and gentlemen, as countries recover from COVID-19 and combat systemic shocks caused by the crisis in Ukraine, strengthening resilience has never been more important. AAAP provides a model that is ready to be scaled up and rolled out to other regions of the world. Please count on GCA as your partner of choice to deliver on this critical agenda. I thank you.
For that description of what the Global Center on Adaptation is doing with many partners around the world, but especially on Africa, through the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And now it is my great pleasure to invite you to watch the video of the Honorable Dr. P.K. Mishra, Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister of India and the CDRI Governing Council co-chair. It is a great pleasure to hear the words of Dr. Mishra. Let's listen to the video.
A warm welcome, Mr. Kees van der Berg, Vice Minister, Mobility, Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands, Professor Patrick Verkhuizen, Chief Executive Officer, Global Center on Adaptation, eminent speakers, and distinguished participants. A very good afternoon to all of you. During the Climate Action Summit in 2019, Honorable Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Modi, announced a global coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure, the CDRI. Last year, the Netherlands joined the CDRI. I thank the Netherlands government, especially the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management of the Netherlands and the Global Center on Adaptation for collaborating with CDRI towards planning for resilient infrastructure. ICDRI, the International Conference for Disaster-Resistant Infrastructure, has become a global platform for discourse on mainstreaming disaster and climate resilience for infrastructure development and offers an opportunity to share experiences, learn, and adopt good practices. So far, the focus has been on mitigation measures like switching to renewable energy sources and energy efficiency. But now it has been recognized that adaptation mandates also require more focus and urgency. This has been one of the major takeaways from Glasgow. According to UN Environment, developing countries alone would need adaptation finance ranging from US $140 billion to US $300 billion annually by 2030. These financing needs could further escalate to anywhere between US $280 billion to US $500 billion annually by 2050. Realizing this level of adaptation financing will require appropriate policies that address market barriers which prevent private investment for adaptation strategies. Different multilateral development organizations are already at the forefront for innovating tools such as sustainability investment criteria, climate-related disclosure principles to stimulate allocation of capital towards climate resilience, adaptation, and overall sustainability. Finance for nature-based solutions and other adaptation strategies should be strengthened and diversified to make it commercially attractive for increasingly crowding in private sector investment combined with public funds, which are essential to bridge the large funding gaps for adaptation. In India, we are not only committed to achieve net zero by 2070, but also to integrate adaptation strategies into our development plans. We are working towards making new infrastructure resilient, strengthening early warning systems, making water resource management resilient, improving dryland agriculture, and protecting mangroves in the east and west coast of India. We are integrating our climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction efforts to maximize the impact of finance available from our own national budget. Today's session, led by the Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management, along with Global Center on Adaptation, brings forth the highlights of the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, or the AAAP. As CDRI's membership gradually expands in Africa, there will be obvious opportunities for collaboration. The learning from AAAP can expedite the adaptation work in other geographies as well, such as small island developing countries. I look forward to interesting and insightful deliberations led by experts and thought leaders on accelerating adaptation investment for resilient infrastructure in vulnerable countries. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Mishra, for those insightful remarks, but also for your personal leadership as co-chair of the Governing Council of CDRI. It is great to see India's global leadership in disaster resilient infrastructure. So thank you so much for those remarks. And let's get into the conversation, ladies and gentlemen. So today, our objective of what the remarks that we want to have today are threefold. First, we want to make sure that we not only talk about resilient infrastructure, but we put people at the center. It's not enough to just build resilient infrastructure. It is critical to build resilient services, resilient infrastructure services. Second, there's not going to be enough concrete in the world to protect us from the impacts of climate change, and therefore how to work with nature, how to implement nature-based solutions so that the infrastructure that is being built today and the infrastructure that exists and operates today can be more resilient to the disasters of today and the disasters of tomorrow due to climate change. And third, how to finance it all, how to make sure that the tremendous needs for the expansion of infrastructure services in developing countries can be financed in a way that rapidly achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and other targets of development from countries around the world, but they can do it also in a resilient way. And one of the examples that we're going to be discussing today is as Patrick, the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, was discussing, is the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP, where actually the idea is working with the African Development Bank and other partners to try to mobilize $25 billion in investments, and one of the pillars of the AAAP is on resilient infrastructure. The recent State and Trends in Adaptation report prepared by the GCA, and I was the co-director, and it was launched. Actually, we were very pleased with President Uhuru Kenyatta in Nairobi at the end of last year, showed that there are tremendous benefits to make infrastructure more resilient. Any dollar that is invested in early warning systems can bring between $4 and $25 in benefits. And a dollar invested in resilient water and sanitation is not only important and fundamental to save the lives of children and people around the world, but it also brings benefit between $12 and $12 in economic benefits. Agriculture, for example, as part of that report, we calculated what is the cost of action of making agriculture in the African continent resilient. Well, it turns out it's about $15 billion a year, but what is the cost of inaction? And the cost of inaction is $200 billion a year. The main message: resilience makes economic sense. It's not only something, it's not only a cost, it's not something that the countries have to do, but it actually pays off. The same can be said in South Asia. For example, the GDP losses in South Asian deltas can reach 9 to 20% by 2030. So the real solution is to implement adaptation, find adaptation solutions implemented at scale. So I hope that the discussion today can go around those three topics and can really help us understand what is happening today, what are the needs in different regions, and actually how partners like ICDRI, GCA, and others around the table can really bring together a fundamental change on infrastructure. So let me introduce the first speaker of today. His Excellency Dr. Kwaku Afriyie is the Minister of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation of Ghana. And Ghana has been working, and we have been very pleased in GCA, to support their efforts on understanding under the AAA program how to prioritize resilient infrastructure. So let us hear from the Honorable Minister Kwaku Afriyie today.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the government and people of Ghana, I am pleased to address the high-level dialogue on accelerating adaptation investments for resilience infrastructure, featured at the International Conference for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. Your Excellency, Ghana wishes to thank the government of the Netherlands and Global Center on Adaptation for hosting this global conference. As we all know, the climate change is here with us, and we are all witnesses of the impact it is bringing to our lives. The IPCC report was described by the UN Secretary General as an atlas of human suffering, and it shows how people and the planet are being affected by climate change. Extreme weather and rapid changes to Ghana's climate present a profound risk to key sectors of Ghana's socio-economic development. Infrastructure in these sectors are the bedrock of the country's economic growth and development. Ghana, through the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation, started working with the Global Center on Adaptation in July 2020 and launched Enhancing the Resilience of Ghana's Infrastructure System project. This project was developed in collaboration with the University of Oxford, the United Nations Office for Project Services, and the United Nations Environmental Program. It focused on the energy, transport, and water sectors to assess climate hazards to infrastructure access and to prioritize adaptation investments to address those risks. Through this innovative work, we in Ghana were able to identify important insights about the resilience of our infrastructure. In particular, energy. Future energy availability for about 250,000 people in rural parts of Ghana is threatened by drought given their reliance on wood fuel for household energy generation. Equally, climate risk threatens major components of the electricity generation and transmission due to exposure to drought and flooding. Water supply and infrastructure. By 2050 and under high hazard conditions, some 54% of dams are exposed to floods and some 23% to droughts. The Wager Dam in particular, supplying some 80% of the drinkable water for Accra's metropolitan area, was found to be particularly exposed to flooding. Transport. In a likely 2050 flooding scenario, analysis revealed the potential of $3.9 billion in damages to roads and highways, triple the estimated $1.3 billion Ghana invested in transport infrastructure in 2019. Through this project, Ghana was able to bring together key institutions within the government to prioritize 35 adaptation options for funders and investors to invest in Ghana's future. The Ghana Roadmap for Resilient Infrastructure in a Changing Climate was officially launched in 2022 with support from all ministers in Ghana and from Ghana's President, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. The implementation of the Resilience Roadmap and the 35 adaptation options will now require additional financial resources from both government and development partner institutions. Therefore, we are pleased that the African Adaptation Acceleration Program, a flagship program between GCA and the African Development Bank, is already working to implement the Scaling Renewable Energy Program, which seeks to support Ghana in the electrification of island communities and move closer to identified development objectives such as sustainable energy for all by 2030. GCA is working with the AFDB to conduct climate risk assessments on potential climate hazards in the district that will benefit from the electrification program. Through its technical assistance program to assess and leverage climate finance, GCA is also providing technical support to the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund as part of its application to become a direct access entity to the Green Climate Fund to enable Ghana to be able to take greater ownership of the implementation of climate finance. We hope that this work is scaled up across Africa and to other countries across the globe to accelerate adaptation investments in resilient infrastructure where needed the most. Thank you very much.
And many thanks to His Excellency Minister Afriye of Ghana for that description of mainstreaming the impacts of climate change and adaptation actions into the infrastructure sectors of the country. Now let me turn to Dr. Kevin Kariuki, Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate and Green Growth at the African Development Bank. And Dr. Kariuki has the very important challenge and magnificent job to mainstream and making sure that everything that the African Development Bank is doing today mainstreams adaptation and the considerations of climate change. I mean, he has led more than $2 billion of privately financed infrastructure and is really responsible for the identification of a pipeline on infrastructure projects under the AAAP. So, Dr. Kariuki, we want to hear a little bit more about how, in reality, the AAAP program is helping African countries prioritize and design resilient infrastructure investments. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. I think the way to answer this question is as follows, and I'll start by saying, compared to Europe and the US, where most of the infrastructure already exists, in Africa, 70% of the infrastructure is yet to be built. The African Development Bank estimates that Africa infrastructure needs are around 130 to 170 billion a year, with an investment gap of between 50 to 60% of that amount. We have also estimated that this gap limits the continent's GDP by about 2% per year. We are already seeing the disruptive impacts of climate change to critical infrastructure systems, escalating the operating costs, exacerbating the infrastructure funding gap, which leads to substantial spillover effects on societies and economies. This constitutes a challenge for people and countries, but I think it also provides an opportunity to learn from global experiences to ensure that going forward, all new infrastructure investments factor in climate change considerations. In this regard, I share the view that promoting adaptation in the planning and design on infrastructure is critical. This, however, requires a change in mindset, away from the current behaviors and practices, which tend to build infrastructure without systematically factoring the current and project climate change impacts. Global figures suggest that integrating resilience into the development of infrastructure projects makes a compelling business case. This is because integrating resilience only adds an average of 3% to the total costs, but with each dollar spent yielding $4 of benefits. Furthermore, it is projected that the use of systemic approach to strengthening resilience in exposed areas can reduce the cost of building resilience by as much as 90% compared to untargeted approach. The African Development Bank is therefore taking the lead in scaling up adaptation in Africa, along with our partner, the Global Center of Adaptation, who together we intend to mobilize $25 billion for adaptation through the ambitious Africa-owned and Africa-led Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which was mentioned by Patrick Vercoen. In its first year, the AAAP has shaped climate adaptation interventions in about $1 billion of investments financed by the Africa Development Bank in the areas of food security, resilient infrastructure, climate finance, and youth employment. And in 2022, we are scaling this further. We are not going to rest on our laurels. Through the AAAP's infrastructure pillar, the Africa Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator, which we aims to integrate climate resilience into $7 billion worth of infrastructure investments on the continent by 2025. In this regard, and based on our experience as Africa's premier MDB, and through scaling up adaptation actions under AAAP, please allow me to highlight 3 key observations to date. 1, in countries that we work in, financing resilient infrastructure assets is important, but more pressingly, we need to ensure these investments translate into resilient and equitable infrastructure services, which underpins the AFDB and AAAP's strategy on infrastructure. In Ghana, for example, you heard from the minister, the bank and GCA have recently worked with the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology and Innovation, the United Nations Office of Project Services, UNOPS, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the University of Oxford in developing a climate-resilient infrastructure investment roadmap. The roadmap highlights how climate risk for roads can affect access to healthcare for up to 80% of women in sub-districts in Ghana. 2, achieving impact at scale requires designing interventions at scale. Recently, the bank has launched the 20 billion Desert to Power initiative, which again was mentioned by the GCA CEO, Patrick Vercoen, is an initiative to chart a low-emission power generation pathway in the Sahel, in the 11 countries of Sahel, through developing a 10 gigawatts of solar generation capacity to provide access to climate-resilient, clean electricity to some 250 million people. 3, we need to invest in nature-based solutions. To date, funding and implementing of NBS nature-based solution programs and projects lags behind, both in Africa and globally. Even though these programs are likely to deliver high return on investment, and even though they can also contribute to climate and environmental goals. Yet, there is strong evidence that nature-based solutions are cost-effective strategy for adaptation and resilience, but deploying such solutions at scale further requires bringing the biodiversity experts into the same room with infrastructure engineers and investors. I can go on and on, but let me stop here. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much, because your message that countries need to ensure that infrastructure is resilient and that investments in infrastructure translate into resilient services is very clear. I want to pick up a statistic that you put. On average, the additional cost to make that infrastructure resilient to the disasters of today and to the climate risks that are coming up is only about 3%. But the benefits that come is for every dollar investment, you get 4 in return. So this is really an important message, as well as saying the understanding not only of the risks of disasters that are happening today, but how much worse they're going to get on climate. To incorporate that in the planning and the prioritization of infrastructure investments is very clear. Thank you so much, Kevin. I want to bring now to the stage Ms. Samantha Stratton-Short, who is the head of strategic initiatives in infrastructure and operations and UNOPS. And UNOPS have been working with the Global Center on Adaptation on a new approach and methodology that was described by the Honorable Minister of Ghana, and is also beginning in Bangladesh, to really understand how to bring all of this together and identify adaptation needs to prioritize investments in resilient infrastructure. So it is my great pleasure, then, Samantha, to invite you to tell us a little bit more about this innovation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting UNOPS to join this panel to discuss this important topic. Just to start off with, among the sort of several services that UNOPS provides, we are explicitly mandated in infrastructure. So that means that we use our experience implementing infrastructure on the ground to promote the criticality of infrastructure to supporting the SDGs, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and contributing to climate adaptation. In terms of addressing how countries ensure that infrastructure is resilient and that investments in infrastructure translate into resilient services, which the doctor from the Africa Development Bank just mentioned so well, we need to identify the priority areas for investment, and that those will meet the current and future challenges to climate change. So it's really critical that governments are able to understand the current state of their infrastructure, what will be their future demands, and what shocks and stresses they will be exposed to. We know already that adaptation costs continue to exceed available funds. possibly by 5 to 10% times the current financial flows, which really highlights the importance of optimally channeling the limited resources available. So this means that evidence-based planning of new assets and managing existing ones is absolutely critical. So to support this, we work with governments on their strategic planning for resilience through assessment of their current and future built and natural infrastructure service needs and their vulnerabilities. We look at the enabling environment that will nurture and deliver resilient services, as well as articulating infrastructure finance strategies that incorporate relevant sources of green finance. So one of the pieces of work that has just been launched, as was just said, just in March, was our work in Ghana. And this was, I think, one of the important things about this work was that we were creating with our partners, as already mentioned, but we were working on an adaptation investment roadmap. This would be input into supporting the revision of the country's NDCs and National Adaptation Plan, as well as capacity building. And it involved the sustained engagement with the government across 24 ministries. The project was in 3 parts to ensure a holistic approach to this adaptation planning. So again, we started by an assessment of the built, natural, and enabling environment adaptation needs. The second part was the roadmap of adaptation investments. And the third part was identifying potential sources for financing. Using the state-of-the-art geospatial analysis, which is developed by the University of Oxford, these national adaptation needs within the built and the natural environment were quantified by intersecting the nationally significant assets with several scenarios involving different types of climate hazards, flooding, landslides, droughts. Then to assess the challenges and possible solutions for the enabling environment, we use the capacity assessment tool for infrastructure, also known as CATI, which was developed by UNOPS. The result of all of this were 35 project concepts in the built, natural, and enabling environment. These were identified as prioritized adaptation options for building a resilient infrastructure system, which would be aligned with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. We're also working with the GCA and the Bangladesh government in Bangladesh on a similar initiative. We're also working there with the Center for Environment and Geographic Information Services in the World Bank. But this is to assess the climate risks to infrastructure, quantify the impact of the provision of services at the household level, as well as the country's development objectives. So this works to reduce the climate risk for Bangladesh's infrastructure and economy by quantifying climate hazard impacts on infrastructure assets and services, also strengthening the understanding of the needs of vulnerable people and communities, and then prioritizing adaptation and resilient investment options. Again, a pipeline of infrastructure adaptation projects, including nature-based solutions, is being developed. And it's also integrating with several key national strategies and plans. And again, we are using an assessment of the planning and project development process around the enabling environment with the CATI tool.
Very much, Samantha. And I think that these 2 good examples show how you can actually do national infrastructure resilient planning for that process. And what I like, particularly in the Ghana case, is that in a simple map, you're able to pinpoint, look, these are some of the bridges that really need action. These are some of the water dams that are critical areas. These are some of the roads that need to be made more resilient so that People can reach the hospitals within an hour under an emergency. That practicality is what allows countries to move into adaptation at a scale. Now, what we want to hear with the next speaker is that this is not only a problem for Ghana and Bangladesh, this is a problem for every country around the world, and we want to talk about the United Kingdom. And it's a great pleasure to have with us Emma Howard-Boyd, who is the chair of the Environmental Agency of the UK. And Emma, look, in the run-up to COP26, you launched the third Climate Adaptation Report under the Climate Change Act of the UK, and really warned leaders that the climate crisis is really significant and urgent. And it's not only important for governments, but also for business and communities. And the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of investing early in climate resilience. So give us an example of how the UK has integrated adaptation and resilience in infrastructure and some of the lessons that the country has learned from this experience.
Thank you, and it's great to be with you all today and really emphasise that this is a whole world effort. When we launched the report, I used the words adapt or die, but for some people it is already too late. India, as we know, has just gone through its hottest recorded March and April, with cities reaching 47 degrees. It is unknown precisely how many have already died, but people fear the coming summer. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes clear, as we already heard, that the window to adapt is closing fast. And last summer in Europe, in Germany, 200 people died in the floods there. It was reported people who heard flood warnings did not know what to do. So we in England reviewed the situation here. And we found that 61% of people living at flood risk do not understand that they are. Climate change is increasing the severity, frequency, and duration of such impacts. At COP26, $130 trillion of private capital was committed to hitting net zero emissions targets by 2050. But we know that without resilience measures, energy infrastructure and supply chains will fail. For every property, our analysis shows that at least 16 other people are affected by disruption to infrastructure and services here in England, and I think that figure is growing. Last year, the Environment Agency completed the government's $2.6 billion six-year programme dedicated to improving flood and coastal defences on time and on budget. The government has then committed to a record £5.2 billion investment in flood protection. This is good news, but to put that in context, the UK's Infrastructure and Projects Authority has analysed over £200 billion of public and private infrastructure investment up to 2024-25. For the equivalent time, England has about £3 billion worth of public money for flood and coastal defences. The private sector is investing billions and expecting the public sector will secure its long-term future. Change is coming. The UK government was instrumental in setting up the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and I'm one of the co-chairs for that. This week, the CCRI team launched an investment prioritisation tool in Jamaica. This uses groundbreaking technology to help the country's energy, water and transport infrastructure most vulnerable to climate risk, ensuring the effective and efficient investment of public and private resources. The UK government is also beginning to send joined up messages and signals to the private sector here in England. So I was pleased to see last month's open letter from our business secretary to economic regulators emphasising climate resilience. The UK will publish an updated green finance strategy by the end of 2022, and I hope this will include more direction on adaptation and resilience for both the public and private sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, for not only for the leadership of the UK presidency at COP26, but really for raising ambitions on adaptation at home. So we have heard examples from Ghana, from Bangladesh, from the UK on how they're leveraging investments in climate resilient infrastructure. Let's move to the other side of the world. The Asia Pacific and the Pacific Seas are also among some of the most vulnerable regions to climate change and also implementing some of the most interesting solutions. So to tell us more about these initiatives, I would like to bring Ms. Noelle O'Brien, who is the Chief of Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management at the Asian Development Bank. So, Noelle, you have been working with countries in Asia and in the Pacific Seas to really assess climate risk to infrastructure and to prioritize adaptation and resilience options to those risks. Tell us more about those activities.
Thank you very much for inviting ADB to join this important panel. So at the moment at ADB, we've adopted a three-track approach for assessing climate risk and strengthening resilience of infrastructure. So at the first asset or project level assessment, this approach is by far the most advanced approach that we have within ADB. In this approach, every single ADB financed infrastructure project is screened and assessed for climate risk. Where risk is medium or high, adaptation and resilience solutions are integrated into the project designs. And these solutions can be engineered based, or they can be nature based, or a combination, or it may be the strengthening of the wider institutional capacity. I just mentioned two examples. Recently, ADB has approved a project for Chennai in India. And this has included climate adjustment factors in the design of the city drainage to deal with increasing flood risk. ADB has also developed an extensive user-friendly database to help countries and project officers to choose appropriate adaptation solutions. And this is continuously updated as we build our expertise. This approach ensures the project can deliver its development objectives despite risk. And just because of the focus on nature-based solutions today, I'd also like to mention some of our work on coral reef insurance. We've been working to develop a mechanism to insure coral reefs in Philippines, Indonesia, Solomon Islands, and Fiji. And the intent here is to insure the reefs against extreme weather events, because funds are then released, which can support immediate repair and support rapid regeneration of the reefs. At a second level, we are evolving an approach at the system level assessment. In this case, a multi-hazard climate and disaster risk assessment is undertaken at the system level. The system can be a whole island, as in the case of the SIDS, a city, or a specific geographical region. And the results of this assessment help to identify the type of infrastructure investments needed to steer development in a resilient approach. We're working to combine these assessments with adaptation pathways approaches. One of the examples of such work is a recent initiative in Tonga on the capital city island of Tonga Tapu, where we've conducted a whole island assessment, and the result of that assessment is forming the basis for developing adaptation pathways that would help identify future investments and a more resilient future. We see this approach as critical to scale up adaptation investments and is very much in line with the recommendations of the recent IPCC AR6 report. The third level, very new to us, is the approach to assess risk at the portfolio level. This ADB is at the initial stage of considering this approach through our work on the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and the commitment to align our operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We expect that with this approach, climate risk will be embedded in the bank's wider risk management framework and help us to identify the implications of such risk on our balance sheets. So thank you.
Thank you, Noel. It's really fascinating to see those three levels and the progress that ADB is making, not only at the project level, but fascinating to see at the systems regional level and also at the portfolio level. I think that this is going to be imperative to identify a pipeline of resilient investments and to figure out how to change the landscape of infrastructure in countries that are working with the ADB. Now, one important source of financing that is always discussed are public-private partnerships. And they have not always been designed with enough consideration of climate risks. They have always sort of, look, this is insurance, or we'll hope for the best and there's going to be a force majeure clause into this process. So what I want to ask Kevin, again, Vice President of the African Development Bank, is what is the role of PPPs in designing, building, operating, and maintaining climate resilience infrastructure? Kevin, your thoughts.
Thank you very much. To start with, infrastructure in Africa is largely financed by national governments, which I believe account for 37% or that 7.5 billion of total commitments by 2018. Furthermore, only 10% of priority infrastructure projects get to make it to project close, with 80% falling by the wayside at feasibility stage level. Therefore, to meet this gap in financing and implementation of infrastructure, it is critical to leverage on public-private partnerships as a mode of delivery for climate-resilient infrastructure. Public-private partnerships are key entry points to integrate climate adaptation and resilience into infrastructure projects. Globally, governments are increasingly turning to PPPs to finance infrastructure and bridge the 15 trillion investment gap expected by 2040. However, there is a lack of knowledge on how PPPs can be used as a tool for addressing climate risks and build climate resilient in infrastructure. There are three reasons, as far as I'm concerned, why PPPs offer a strategic instrument to mobilize adaptation investments. First, the incentive structure of PPP establishes project requirements that allow for resilient and adaptive assets or services. The need for a robust revenue model also ensures that adaptation and resilience options are linked to clear financial benefits for the operator and the public sponsors. Second, PPPs enable the allocation of risk between public and private partners in a way that best mitigates certain climatic conditions and yield resilient benefits. Third, the focus on measurable outputs and performance stimulates innovation, such as resilient design standards and nature-based solutions, which can reduce the costs over the infrastructure life cycle. These lessons underpin the masterclass on climate resilient infrastructure in PPPs that was launched under the AAAP in 2021, with partners including the bank, AFDB, the Global Center on Adaptation, the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction Development, among others. In 2022, we are now deploying this product to support investment projects across the bank's portfolio. Moving forward, I believe that private sector participation in climate resilient infrastructure or investments is critical, as the transformation and innovation required to build resilience into infrastructure projects cannot be delivered by the public sector alone. Partnerships between public and private sectors therefore constitute a key driving force to bridge the existing infrastructure gap while ensuring climate resilience. I must say, as a student of PPPs, I would go on and on, as I'm passionate about the subject. But let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I know that you're Very passionate about the subject, and it's great to see that within the AAAP, this masterclass is beginning to bring the best science on climate change and the best practice to really make sure that the design of those projects, where the public and the private come together, can really mainstream infrastructure for that process. Now, what I want to invite you is to watch a video of an example of a public and private infrastructure project in the Netherlands that has integrated nature-based solutions for resilient infrastructure. When we think about PPPs in infrastructure, we only think about the concrete solutions, the cement, the steel, but actually nature is an integral way of finding and building resilient infrastructure. Let's watch the video. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will learn more about this interesting project. Now, you have all, as panelists, given us so much wealth of information that we are unfortunately coming towards the end of this panel. But I want to give each of you the opportunity to give one final message to the audience on different perspectives, very shortly, so that we are running a little bit over of time, but I just coordinated with the conference organizers to give us a few more minutes to wrap it all up. So I want to go to Emma. One key message that you want the audience to remember on nature-based solutions. Why are they so important?
The importance of working with nature means that we have to get on and form those public-private partnerships. We've got one example in the UK, the National Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which is bringing together government, relevant agencies, including the Environment Agency, Natural England, and the private sector to build a pipeline of investable projects so that we can get on and take action and then share that knowledge around the world. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for setting up the tone of how we're wrapping up the panel. Samantha, from UNOP's perspective, what do you think is the most important challenge that developing countries are facing for resilient infrastructure?
Oh, thank you. I think one of the most important challenges is how to actually take on uncertainty and working with a systems approach. And this translates into the enabling environment because infrastructure processes are inherently complex and they take a long time. And therefore, getting that right across, the enabling environment governance in the government processes is extremely difficult. And so one of the most important things to look at is how to have cross-sectoral bodies for decision-making and implementation to actually ensure that resilience can be embedded into good infrastructure solutions.
Excellent, Samantha. Cross-sectoriality, fundamental for resilient infrastructure. Let's go to Noel. Noel, in the ADB, you have innovated so much on financing instruments. Tell us what is one example that makes you the most proud. Give us one example.
Thank you. I think that we'll focus in on our community resilience financing partnership facility, which we launched at COP26, which among other aims at developing innovative bottom-up financing mechanisms to promote resilient infrastructure at the community level. And such infrastructure could be part of social development projects, such as public works program implemented by many countries in Asia and the Pacific region. And the key to this program is to empower local communities in adaptation-related decision-making. So critically important.
Noel,
thank you.
Noel, I would agree with you. I really like that program, and we're looking forward to interesting results and lessons that we can bring to Africa and the AAAP program. Kevin, you have the final word. If other regions of the world want to do something transformational, like the Africa Acceleration Adaptation Program, what would be your advice? One or two things that you would tell Asia Pacific or Latin America and the Caribbean, this is what we're learning from the African Development Bank with the AAAP.
Thank you very much. The one thing that I would say is that for taking the example of AAAP, whose success is based on the fact that it is Africa-owned and Africa-led, and the fact that it builds from priority areas identified by African countries in their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, as well as their national adaptation plans. This generates momentum for large-scale investments, innovations, knowledge, and technical assistance initiatives. So in my view, to be honest, to date, I'm not aware of any other adaptation initiative that has achieved this level of consensus. So consensus amongst governments is absolutely critical. So in my view, to say, from my experience, in priorities adaptation and in championing adaptation initiatives as AAAP, we also believe that the South-South cooperation can work. In my view, we should be able to work with other regions to share our experience. But the fact is, we believe we can be able to share our experience and expertise in implementing AAAP with South Asia and other small island developing states, which have similar challenges as Africa has, with a view to building solid coalitions on scaling up adaptation in developing countries. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kevin, Noel, Samantha, Emma, and the institutions that you're representing, the African Development Bank, the UK government, the Asian Development Bank, and UNOPS, for this fascinating conversation on how to make resilient infrastructure as part of the ICDRI conference. We wish you success with the other panels, and thank you so much for all the participants today. I hope that you have learned about the practicalities of planning, implementing, monitoring, and adapting to climate change. Thank you so much.